Hey class, thanks for showing up for our first video. Today's first video's name is Archaeological Detective Work 101. Alright, basically this is a scientific method in archaeology quick primer kind of thing. And what I'm going to go through here is some of the basic ideas about how science is done in archaeology. That way you'll start to understand a little bit better what we're doing specifically, what's the idea behind what we're trying to go for, and what some of the basic differences between the science you see in anthropology, archaeology, most of the social sciences, and you see in all other sciences. And if you had scientific methodology classes back when you were in high school or since you've been in college, you'll start to understand what I'm talking about. All right. If not, some of this is a new ideas, new concepts to you. Just please pay attention. You'll catch up and you'll understand what's going on. All right, so just give me a little bit. This video should take about 15 minutes, and hopefully you'll get the gist of what I'm saying. What is science? Well, bear with me a little bit. I'm reading off the slides along with you as I'm doing this, and it's right to my left. So if you see me look away from the camera, that's what I'm doing. Science is a systematic study of the structure and behavior of the world through observation and experiment. Basically, what we're saying here is that we are attempting to look at the world and through some type of process be able to try to understand it. That's what we're doing with science. And there's a lot of different ways we can come to this, right? It's not just one. If you, like I said earlier, if you had classes on the scientific, how science works in the methodology of science back in high school or college, you probably got a completely different view of what I'm about to give you in the next 15 minutes. It's a little quick primer. Meaning, basically, they do what they refer to as hypothesis verification. And I'm going to show you why we do things a lot differently over here. All right, we have some definitions on this slide. I'm going to go through those real quickly with you because I'm going to be also doing these again through the next several slides as well. Deduction, the inference of instances by reference to a general law principle. Falsification, the capacity for a statement, theory, or hypothesis to be contradicted by evidence. Induction, the process of reasoning in which the premises of an argument support the conclusion but do not ensure it. Abduction, the process of seeking the simplest and most likely conclusion from the given observations. And plausibility, the quality of seemingly reasonable or probable. I'm going to again talk about each one of these as we go, but real quickly, in the aspect of deduction and falsification, these two things go together. Deduction is based on the concept of a principle, meaning that there is a view of science here that says we have to do things in a logical form of way. And their logical form is through falsification, meaning that if you come up with a hypothesis that cannot be disproven by any test, then we're going to go ahead and throw it out and say we can't use that. All right. That's basically the concept. Karl Popper came up with this idea back in the 1930s, all right? And it's, as far as dealing with the natural sciences, the hard sciences, it absolutely is true, all right? But when you are dealing with systems, extremely complex systems, like human beings and society and culture itself, right? Suddenly falsification kind of gets thrown out the window because we can't really apply it to these incredibly complex data sets, right? And thus we have to use things like statistics to be able to understand them. Thus, why we start using induction. And induction, the process of reasoning, in which the premises of argument support the conclusion but not necessarily ensure it. We are trying to get to as close to as possible the actual I wouldn't want to say truth, but what we can basically say, what's the most supportive view for what we're trying to say, right, for statistical purposes. Um, because you have so much moving parts, so much data here going on, it's very difficult to actually make any determinations as absolute. All right, and a part of induction, a variation of induction, is what we as archaeologists do, which is called abduction, which is that process of seeking the simplest and most likely conclusion given observation, meaning that we're inferring to the best explanation. Meaning that, all right, we're using the same concept that William Ockham came up with to say that if all things are equal, the simplest answer is usually the correct one. What is the most probable, which is the last term we have here? The quality of seemingly reasonable and most probable. We're looking at the most probable in what we do in this form of science. And I'll get into that a little bit. I'll get into that more depth in the next slides. Deduction. Going back through this again. The inference of instances by reference to a general law or principle. The process of reasoning from one or more statements, premises to reach a logical conclusion. Deductive reasoning goes in the same direction that all the conditionals and links and premises with its conclusions. If all premises are true, the terms are clear, and the rules of deductive logic are followed, then the conclusion reaches necessarily true. A prime example of this is mathematics. In math, you know full well 2 plus 2 is going to equal 4. All right. The premises of both 2 and 2 are true. Therefore, that guarantees the solution. All right. That's what we mean by deductive logic. All right. And the deductive form that we use, again, in normal science is falsification. Falsifiability, the capability for a statement, theory, or hypothesis to be contradicted by evidence. That's what we're talking about when we refer to as process. There's a specific process, there's a certain amount of steps we're going through in the scientific methodology between the creation of a hypothesis and making sure that there is possibly some type of test that can disprove that hypothesis, has the capability to disprove that hypothesis. And that's really what they're doing in this methodological process of science, all right, created by Karl Popper, who made the argument that science should have this system set up to as checks and balances as we go through it. So therefore, anything that we have that can't be supported because you're coming up with a theory that can't be supported by anything, all right, we have to have something to say, to come in and say, nope, that doesn't work, all right, there's nothing to support that contention, therefore we throw it out. And again, this works perfectly fine if you are dealing with aspects of 2 plus 2 is 4, like I mentioned earlier, mathematics, if you're dealing with like physics, if you're dealing with chemistry, and things that have, absolute, you insert tab A into slot B, and you get this result. That's absolutely true for those types of things, right? However, when you're dealing with the social sciences, you have a really big problem. You're dealing with massive data sets. You're dealing with a historiographical standpoint of view, meaning we're dealing with history. We're dealing with all kinds of things here that have an effect of what we're talking about. We can't just go back in time. So when we are talking about falsification in the perspective of the hard sciences, they can do those kinds of things. But when you're dealing with systems that are massively complex, like we're dealing with archaeology and all the social sciences, it's impossible to do. And I'm getting the next slide on that. And just as I said earlier, we don't have any time machines. I can't go back in time and check to see if I'm right. This aspect of anthropology is indicative of most social sciences that work with people who are trying to divine and predict behavior, especially within a historical perspective. If I make a claim regarding a particular behavior or some population group that existed 10,000 years ago in the past, I don't really have a way to falsify that claim. And just as I said earlier, when you're dealing with massive data sets, when you're dealing with something as complex as human culture, as society, as anything you can think of in the aspect where we're dealing with millions upon billions of moving parts that are all working independent of each other, right? And are not going to do anything that is predictive at all right? Then this concept of falsification kind of goes out the window. And that's the important thing you need to take away from it. And this is why we do this way. That's the reason we do the science we do over here in archaeology. Induction is actually, believe it or not, what we're really doing as opposed to deduction. Induction is the process of reasoning within premises and argument to support the conclusion, but they will not necessarily ensure it. A method where one's experiences and observations, including what are learned from others, are synthesized to come up with a general pattern that we can infer from. Inductive reasoning is distinct from deductive reasoning. While the conclusion of deductive reasoning is certain, the truth of the conclusion of the deductive argument is probable based upon the evidence given. Meaning, and again, we have a lot of word salad going on here, meaning that just like Sherlock Holmes had made his argument, if you eliminate all the impossibilities, whatever left, how improbable must be the truth, all right? The exact same thing we're doing. He called it deductive reasoning in the book Sir Arthur Conan Doyle did, but actually what he's talking about was actually inductive reasoning and a specific type of inductive reasoning. And I'm going to show you that. We balance the probabilities and choose the most likely. It's a scientific use of the imagination. That's a quote from the Hound of Baskervilles. The specific type of thing he was doing was referred to as abduction. It's the process of seeking the simplest and most likely conclusion from given observations. It's a subset of inductive reasoning. Abduction is what we literally see Sherlock Holmes doing that he calls deduction. And again, he did that incorrectly. We refer to it in anthropology as inference to the best explanation. Instead of trying to establish justification or falsification, archaeologists attempt to establish a hypothesis that fit the given evidence. We refer to this as plausibility. Again, a lot of word salad here. But what you need to understand is that the type of science that we're doing is greater than just the idea of hypothesis testing based on falsification. We don't get me wrong, we do that too. We do a lot of things like that, like endochronological methods where we're looking at tree rings, right? That's an exact dating method, all right? And that's a deductive method where we can figure out exact dates and times. We're doing carbon-14 dating, which uses an exact scientific methodology to be able to calculate the most probable time frame that someone may have that this artifact or this piece of bone or material came from. All right, but based on all that information, we're taking all that information and we're putting it together to create we'll create a hypothesis to get to the human behavior itself. I liken it very much to being, and that's why I use Sherlock Holmes as an example of this, to being like a cop. As a police officer, your job is to basically use all those forms of methodology, but your job is to catch the bad guy. Your job is to seek justice, all right? The job is not just to use those various different tools, all right, and then stop. You're using those tools to get to something specific, all right, which is catching bad guys, all right? Archaeology is the exact same way. We use a lot of deductive tools to get us to a position that we can create hypotheses that focus specifically on the human behavior, all right? And that's what we're trying to understand. That's what we're trying to get at, all right? In many ways, we're historical detectives. We're attempting to understand the archaeological record, but we're also trying to understand specifically human behavior itself. That's what we're trying to get to. And the hypothesis we're formulating and presenting is based on all that deductive methodology from before, right? But also using inductive methods like induction to be able to create hypothesis, all right, that point our finger, okay, this is what I think is actually going on, all right? And I'm going to reiterate the exact same thing in the same slide. So in effect, what we're doing is reviewing the material and based on both solid scientific procedure and what we've learned from the archaeological and historical perspective, attempt to understand human behavior. We're doing more than trying just to figure out the who or the how. We're attempting to understand the why. Or to look at this piece of rock art here, we have to formulate hypothesis to be able to understand what it is we're looking at, because there's no amount of deductive reasoning we can come up with that can tell us anything more than there's a piece of art on that rock. We're going to have to be able to take all of our combined knowledge from talking to people, from historical perspectives, from specific analysis, from all those various different things, and use this to construct our hypothesis, all right, about what we think is going on and perhaps what is it they were doing here that led them to do this particular kind of behavior, all right, and that is that is in the sense the exact what we're doing as the science of archaeology. Thanks a lot for paying attention. I hope between this video, the slides, and everything else I wrote in the assignment, you'll understand what's going on. I will see you guys in class on Thursday. Thanks a lot, and you have a good day.